decades, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have shaped the financial landscape of developing nations, offering loans, policy advice, and economic programs. But their influence has not been without controversy on the African continent. Accusations of debt dependency, stringent loan conditions, and economic prescriptions that don't always fit local realities, though the presence of an institution on the African continent like the African Development Bank. Well, now a new player is emerging on the African continent. The Alliance of Style States have decided to create a new bank, the AES Investment and Development Bank, with a startup capital of 500 billion francs CFA. Could this institution provide a real alternative to the International Monetary Fund and World Bank? Will it reshape the balance of global finance, giving developing nations more control over their economic futures? Alternatively, will it simply be another lender in a complex financial ecosystem? Today we dissect these questions with our experts this day and asking the question, is the global financial order on the brink of transformation? Do stay with us. This is Talking Point. Hello Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on this fresh edition of Talking Point of our Pan-African channel for you Media Africa, for honoring our invitation and shedding more and more light about the titles you carry.
Thank you.
Well, we equally got indications that Dr. Stanley FONGOD is just joined us in his capacity as an economist, a Pan-Africanist, and the CEO of Crosston FINTECH. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Sharon, for having me, and also thank my co-partners for joining in as well.
All right, to kickstart today's conversation, I'll start with you, Mr. Engineer. Now, we're getting this creation of the AES Investment and Development Bank shortly when we know on the African continent we already have the existence of the African Development Bank, which we still have nations within the continent that solicit loans from them rather than the International Monetary Fund. Like I mentioned in the preamble, some of the interest rates are somewhat high as compared to the realities on ground, given that these are developing countries on the African continent. Now, in a bit to comprehend what might have led to the creation of this bank, what gaps in the financial or global financial systems led to the creation of this investment bank?
Okay, permit me begin already by telling here, should I say, as a Pan-Africanist, I will begin by congratulating these three African states, that is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, for this wonderful initiative, because to me it directly challenges the AU. Exactly. Which to me has failed Africans woefully ever since it was created. And when you ask to know what might have pushed them into creating, I will begin by telling you that in creating any institution, or when you create any institution, what permits it to move forward is first of all the spirit in it. It is the spirit behind its creation. Yes. You see, and I want to think that when they decide to create such an investment bank, it is because they feel that Africa for over the decades has been lured into wanting to think that they could develop, they could grow with the IMF and the World Bank, when in reality that has never been the case. Exactly. And you will understand therefore when I mention the idea of the spirit behind the creation of such institutions, the spirit I want to think behind the IMF and the World Bank was never one intended to permit Africa to emerge. You see, so at the end of the day, people sit somewhere, conceive an idea, create an institution of theirs for their own intentions and reasons, and then they lure Africans into thinking that we are one. And so you go to them. If you take a country like Cameroon, we cannot remember. In fact, we know how many thousands of billions we are owing them today. You see, at the end of the day, they give money for projects which is embezzled by officials. They know that the money has been embezzled, but they keep adding more because they use it at the end of the day as a bait to tie you down and then tap your resources in whatsoever different way. And at the end of the day, the population doesn't stand to benefit anything from all these loans. And I think this is something that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger understood and thought it wise to maybe step out of not only ECOWAS, and now they're even going away from the AU in doing what the AU has failed to do. You mentioned the idea of the African Development Bank. It's good that we already have the African Development Bank, but I want to also think that there is a need for Africa Africans to have many of such institutions on the continent, because when we have many of them, it creates room for competitiveness, it creates room for competition, and thereby gives people the options, the latitudes to choose where to belong to, maybe in terms of the services that each of the institutions do offer. The next thing I will also tell you is that when they say that these countries are beginning with 500 billion, and we know that over the years they have always made us understand that Niger was one of the poorest nations in the world. Then imagine if Niger, which is one of the poorest, can be part of a 500 billion initiative of this nature, then imagine what will happen to Africa if all of our other African countries accept to come together and then put in their little bit to see how much more we can put together to be able to come up with something quite gigantic for the African continent. So to me, it's a laudable initiative, because I want to believe it will defend the interests of the Africans and let them understand that amongst us as Africans, we can do far better off than wanting to depend on something that was created without us. You know, sometimes on your platform here, we've spoken lengthily about BRICS, for instance. I am one of those who think that the idea in itself is not that bad, but it's not all the best. Because even the BRICS in itself, where we have South Africa so far already a member, South Africa only came in to join. But like I say, if you go into what the founding fathers of BRICS, for instance, had at the back of the mind before creating, maybe Africa was relegated to the background, you see. So they will only lure you into joining something without having a better mastery and understanding as to why it was created. And at the end of the day, you are just following, maybe giving room for people to continuously exploit our continent, which they have done for several centuries now. So I think African countries should rather follow the examples of these three great nations. To me, they are great nations, because to me, greatness here is not in terms of size, but in terms of initiatives and in terms of what they have as ambitions, not only for the three countries, but for the African continent.
Like you rightly mentioned, you know, it's imperative for African nations to come together for the development of this project, like was anticipated by those three countries who came up with the creation of the Investment Bank and Investment and Development Bank for the Alliance of Sahel States. They stated that 500 billion francs CFA was quite small for such an institution. But with time, they envisage that maybe private investment will come in, you know, to boost further this vision. Now, to you, Dr. FONGOD, having listened to your co-panelist, from your perspective, he says it's imperative for African nations to come further and come together in defending this initiative. But from your part, how can the AES Investment and Development Bank differ from the IMF and World Bank, so that we are not getting back to, you know, the same mistakes? And do you agree that the limitations of the African Development Bank led up to the creation of this new bank we're seeing on the African continent?
I think, you know, this morning is probably quite good for me. I know it's afternoon there, but it's morning here. And this morning is beautiful. I think it's a beautiful day for me to be speaking with someone who basically understands that the EU is dead. As a matter of fact, to even state that the EU is struggling is an understatement. I think that at this particular point in time, like we would do it in Cameroon, people need to bring drinks and stuff and let's celebrate, because frankly speaking, this is the passing, you know, of a gigantic monumental failure, and which is basically the EU. So whatever the boys in the Sahel are doing is a testament to the failure of the EU. That being said, I think that they're doing quite well. By the way, 500 billion CFA is quite ambitious, and the reason for that is because those three nations all just below 20 million, about 19 point something million in depth, all right, shared between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. So we are looking at, in dollars, by the way, so we're looking at three nations that are absolutely taking their destiny into their own hands. Obviously, I don't think that there is any downside to what is it that they're doing, but on the upside, once foreign direct investments into those three countries were basically stifled as a result of all the sanctions, because they left the West, they left ECOWAS. It became somewhat mandatory for them to be able to find alternative means and methods of basically funding themselves. Small to medium-sized enterprises in these particular regions also did suffer significantly, and just for the fact that they were excluded, you know, from the broader market in the western part of of Africa, and you're talking about larger market like Nigeria and Ghana. That being said, these three nations have decided to create this alliance and also, fund projects, especially projects that will open up the market within those three countries and help small to medium-sized enterprises within those three countries to basically flourish. There will be great opportunities, especially for now foreign investors looking at this particular bank and basically trying to be able to put their money there, because believe it or not, irrespective of whatever the public opinion will be, the market decides a lot of things that happen so far as investments is concerned. You would think that a place like the DRC, with AK-47s basically being brandished like cell phones, with bullets flying, like hailstones, people will basically run away from that particular region. Well, that's not what the market is saying. If you look at a place like Goma, despite the upheaval, despite the pain and the chaos that is taking place in Goma, in the DRC, folks are still mining. Okay, financial transactions are still taking place because of that scarce commodity that everyone is in search of. That is the market. So in this part of the world, in the Sahel, I think that this bank will only come to foster, irrespective of whatever sanctions that there may be. The market will speak, and frankly speaking, this is the first step of not just an independent, a tri-state between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. This will be the template for what will be, a broader emancipation strategy, in the Western Bloc. Hopefully, those boys in ECOWAS will learn a thing or two from the guys in the Sahel.
And indeed, this is the way out of, economic liberation for West Africa and definitely the African continent. Back to you, Mr. Engineer. You listened to your co-panelists. I believe you agree with some points. Now, you shared the same opinion earlier on that the IMF and World Bank were institutions, Western institutions that initially were not created for the African continent. A view that is being shared, I believe your co-panelists will share the same assertion, and numerous pundits on the African continent have often slammed the economic hardships that come with and the loans that have been gotten from these Western financial institutions, especially on borrowing nations. We don't want to cite the number of countries on the African continent that are still reeling from debt because of, the number of debts they have with these global institutions. But nonetheless, we saw these three countries. Initially, they started with the creation of a passport. They moved to announcing they were going to go towards, having a single currency. They equally, projected, looking at their governance structures, which is one that does not entirely align with the norms of the regional bloc, the Economic Community of West African States. But do you valid, or how valid do you think this assertion is as far as the policies these institutions have vis-a-vis the African continent?
You see, Sharon, when sometimes you are pushed to the wall and you really need to, like my brother said, take your destiny into your hands, there are some stated principles you must go against. Because when some of these principles, like I say, initially are not or were not defined to help Africa. When we talk about regional blocks, I don't know, you may be making reference to things like ECOWAS. True. I call it the thing. Because AU failed. We have ECOWAS that has also proven that it is also failing, because we know if these three countries stepped out of ECOWAS, we saw all what happened when the different military takeover started coming up from that True. Part of Africa. ECOWAS did not really prove like they were out for the general interest of the Africans in that part of the African continent, but they were acting more like they were receiving instructions from certain foreign countries and thereby acting in the interest of those people rather than in the interest of the African good. So in that case, you see, these three leaders, to me, they have understood and have taken the destiny of their people into their hands, and they are trying to dictate the pace. And to me, as a Pan-Africanist, I go in line with them. Now, when you realize that some other African countries for now may not feel comfortable with the whole situation, not because they don't admire what these guys are doing, but because they still fear, let me put it in quotes, the colonial masters. They still feel like if I join these guys, what happens to me? I may lose my position, I may.
Sanctions.
You see, but these are guys who have not only taken their destiny into their hands, but they have defeated fear too. You see, so talking about regional blocks, to me, there is nothing about regional blocks if the regional blocks are not working to the best interest of the Africans. you see. And we must we have come to a point in time where, as Africans, we must understand the need for us as a people to understand that our destiny as Africans, we are the only people to determine how it looks like in the future. After all, if you go from the pre-colonial to the colonial to the post-colonial era, we realize, like I always like to remind people, that the Western powers are a set of persons with whom you do not lie with in the same bed with both eyes closed, because their interest comes first, it comes second, and it comes third. We are nowhere found in their plan. But of course, again, I will not blame them for that. It's all about politics, and it's all about a game of interest. And if you are going into a game of interest with someone and you do not first of all value your own self, you do not first of all understand where your own value stands, you do not, then of course, but normal that they should play you the game the way they can do it. So to me, if I got your question well, regional blocks to me really do not count as of now, as far as these three nations are concerned. What is most important to me is the fact that they have taken the bull by the horns. They are trying to shape their own future. Let the Western world and the ECOWAS and the others allow them to do the things the way they can do them. As you say, they started with their passport. They are talking of a common currency. Mind you that when we talk about currency, even look at all African countries. When you start classifying them by virtue of development, the first developed or so-called developed countries in Africa, or those at least moving towards development, are countries that have their own currency. So you understand that it's but normal to that we could never and shall never be developed for as long as we continue with the CFA. And worst of all, from which country? France. France is the last of countries in the world that we ever want to see the African continent emerge. France has nothing of its own in terms of resources. They depend entirely on Africa, be it for both human and natural resources. You see, so it's but normal that they keep tying us to their loins in the name of that's determine our financial policies and every other thing, determine the prices on our markets on local products or our raw material. So the moment until we understand that we need to have a currency of ours, but I am happy with this, with what these three leaders are doing, because as of now, what I have in mind, I understand is that, like I mentioned, the idea of the spirit behind creation of an institution. Any other African country as of now that would decide to join this development bank they have created, the truth is that you will be going to dance with their own tune and rhythm. True. And these three have proven themselves to be people who are Pan-Africanists and want the interests of Africans. So you will only come into align to what they already said. You understand why I said when the IMF was being created, Africans were not on the table. When the World Bank was created, Africans were not on the table. When BRICS was being created, Africans were not on the table. It means they had their core principles, and each person come in was just coming to toe the line, and they said, okay, this is what we said, so if you accept, you align. So any other person that will eventually join them, and I'm sure that as time goes on, people will eventually have to join them, because when you look at still in West Africa, take countries like Senegal, the young leaders there are proving that they themselves are not in alliance with France and other people. It means that they may eventually drift towards the Sahel countries. So as time goes on, one doesn't know, but I think I am optimistic that it will happen that way. As time goes on, many more will eventually be joining them gradually, especially when they prove their worth. Stanley was mentioning something about maybe private investments or investors coming in. I'm convinced that people will come into the whole show. Why? Because these are leaders who have proven that the interest they are fighting for is not their interest as leaders, it's not their interest as heads of states, but the interest of the people. And once you convince people that you are fighting for the general good, many more want to join you. We have thousands upon thousands of Africans the world over who are millionaires, maybe even billionaires, but who dream to come back into the African continent and invest. But what prevents them is the fact that our current leaders have not convince them that the environment is that conducive for them to come back home. So with these three leaders, don't be surprised that you will see Africans from other African countries running now back to the Sahel region to go and start investments from there. So I am very, very optimistic that they are on a good footing. 500 billion may not be anything much, but to use the terms of Dr. Stanley, it is quite ambitious. And I'm convinced that many more persons, even privately, will eventually join them and back them up in this initiative, and then Africa will move a step forward.
Indeed, it's all about, taking the African continent forward. Now, I'll pick up from there. Dr. Fongod, your co-panelist stated that there is a need on the African continent to have an alternative, for the franc CFA. Let's take an example. Look at the country of Uganda. When a country imposes LGBTQ law in this nation, it got sanctions from the World Bank, it got sanctions from the IMF, it got sanctions from Washington. But then the country stood steadfast amidst all the challenges, and as it stands, even from AGOA, as it stands, the nation, when coming up with the the development project we discussed in one of our editions with Burundi, they were looking at certain alternatives like the African Development Bank, which we know have some flaws, have some limitations. But now with the creation of this bank, I don't want to discuss, I'd like to drift away from that to pick up from where Ms. NJINE stopped. But in your opinion, as an economist, what is the best alternative for franc CFA, not just for West Africa, but for the African continent?
First of all, franc CFA is one of the biggest scam. All right, it's one of the biggest scam post-colonial era on the continent of Africa. The money is basically pegged against the euro, to which it is that its monetary and financial policies are basically designed by francs, which means there is nothing else but pure manipulation. It affects everything from purchasing, settling our debts. We have absolutely zero control on what happens so far as our monetary and financial policies are concerned. Our destiny is not in our hands, it's actually in the hands of francs alone, which means the total amount of money on fees and transactions and just the sheer tendency that they do manipulate the currency basically throws each and every one of us, in the country. What that means is this, that in a billion years, you probably might never be able to pay any debts if they don't want you to. It doesn't matter what you do. So these are the things that we need to be able to do so that we can be able to emerge with our own currency, a currency that is Afrocentric in nature, a currency that basically fuels the mind, the will, and the vision of the African from an Afrocentric perspective. That means we do whatever it takes for our own goodwill. And there is no way francs has anyone's interest at heart except that of francs. And I don't blame them for that. I don't think that, I sit on the sideline and go, France is such a bad nation. Yes, well, so what? The problem is all of us on African continents that have allowed this madness to continue for so long, we are the fools. Right? So when somebody scams you once and then scams you the second time, and then you talk about the third time how this guy is a scammer, when the guy counts the fourth time and continue to scam you, it is no longer the person's problem. All right? It is your own problem. So the people with the highest level of blame is these, Neanderthals. I'm talking about these ancient of days, these people who basically have, occupied positions, in infinitum, that basically wants just to continue in the same trajectory and take us absolutely nowhere. So when we see the boys in the Sahel basically doing the things that they're doing, basically taking somewhat of the good things within a bloc like ECOWAS, all right, somewhat of a regional passport, and then talking about creating an alliance where they can be able to allow goods and services to basically, go in between those three nations, allowing small to medium-sized enterprises within those nations to flourish, having the tendency to be able to help, regions in those countries that have goods and services that other regions do need, growing the local economy, allowing for the unbanked people in those nations to actually be included in the banking sector, because many people in these sectors are not included in the banking sector. Those are absolutely measurable things, good things that we can be able to measure and we can be able to see. So when we talk about the fact that, in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are presenting a template for the continent of Africa, a template that groups like the EU or ECOWAS, can only dream of. It's as a result of the fact that we are seeing tangible, measurable progress, from those guys in the Sahel. And I think that it's something to be celebrated. When it comes to the CFA, I don't think that, that's even a point of conversation. The CFA is as evil as anything else, that came with colonialism, as anything else that came with slavery. As a matter of fact, the CFA, it's one of the long-lasting legacy of colonialism on the continent of Africa. And frankly speaking, there is no reason why we should be using the CFA. We can gradually ease ourselves out of the CFA by basically allowing a currency. If the EU was serious, we will have a currency on the continent of Africa Africa, if ECOWAS was serious, we will have a currency in the western part of the country, in that western bloc, where we can be able to superimpose that currency as to what the euro is to Europe. In that way, we basically find a way to phase out the CFA and become truly independent. There is no reason why anyone on the African continent should continue using the CFA. We rather go trading in cowrie shells and God knows what in between before we start thinking about the fact that the CFA has any value in terms of our monetary and physical policy so far as the continent of Africa, so far as the country of Africa is concerned, and all of those member states, that are using the CFA, look at them. My co-panelist was talking about it. Look at their economic standings, look at, their level of exports, and then look at how rich those countries are, and look at that level of development. You see the contract distinction, and frankly speaking, it's quite shameful.
Now, Dr. FONGOD, you stated that, African nations, especially those in West Africa and Central Africa, should phase out the franc CFA. But it didn't really specify what would be replacing if we have to actually scrape it off. So, in your perspective, what tangible currency could be, the better alternative, the best alternative for the African continent? Should African leaders or the experts on the continent, rely on, trying to come up with something that is virtual or something that would depend on the minerals that the continent has? Or in your perspective, what's the best alternative?
Well, I think that the best alternative for us will be able to create a currency. They have been talk in ECOWAS about creating a currency that will be able to serve the region. And I think that that makes sense. First of all, a currency that will serve the region simply means that we are not going to use the dollar to settle our debts. For example, somebody trading in Nigeria with somebody in Ghana will be able to use that currency rather than using the dollar to settle their debts because we have the Naira and the cedis in Ghana. We need to be able to find ways in which we basically follow through. It's not as if to say these ideas are quite new. These are quite old ideas. ECOWAS basically came out and said they were going to create this currency, to take care of the Western Bloc, and that currency has not been created. And when we do create this currency, we need to be able to make sure that the currency is backed with a natural resource. And I think that the only natural resource that I think is of value and that has this intrinsic value in itself that will be able to make sure that we don't have to do with the issues of inflation. It's difficult to get. The cluster abundance is known because that's what money is. Money has to be so valuable and yet so limited. You cannot use any other commodity as money if you can just reprint it or if it is something else that can be created artificially. There's one mineral we know that we cannot do any alchemy for it, which means that you cannot artificially create it, and that mineral is gold. I am a big time proponent of the fact that any currency needs to be backed by gold. I have a cryptocurrency myself, which is pegged or backed 100% by gold. Every currency has to be backed by gold. The reason for that is because then the issues of inflation basically does not exist. If you look at gold, for all the gold that has ever been mined in this world is still present on earth. The ones that people like Mansa Musa touched, the ones that people like Napoleon Bonaparte came in contact with, King Charles. I mean, we're talking about from 10,000, BC, all that gold is still present on planet Earth, except a few components of those gold in electronic gadgets that basically are being used in satellite systems. Apart from that, every ounce of gold ever mined is still here. And the cluster abundance of gold is something else that is not going to suffer oxidation. There is no talk about gold disappearing because it's basically decaying. That's not the case. The cluster abundance of gold in the earth crust is known, and we know that there is not going to be any increase whatsoever, and that is the true definition of money. We cannot just be printing money like mad people. We cannot manipulate money like mad people. We need to be able to make sure that we understand that all money has to have these qualities, which means that we cannot just inflate it by printing more, and that the money has to remain in a certain quantity for there to be a maximum appreciation of value. That is what we need to do. If that was going to be the case, why don't we just use this abundant gold that we have? For example, in a place like Mali, Mali is known for gold. I think that there's more mining. Its whole entire GDP is based upon gold mining. Why don't we just use something as gold to back up any other currency that we basically come out with on the continent? And if that was going to be the case, believe me, many other countries around the world will want to settle their debts with our own currency and the currency that we come out with on the African continent, if not just on the Western Bloc. And the reason is because if you have a currency that is backed by gold, you are automatically guaranteed that that currency is inflation proof, and there will never be a day that you wake up and the value has just suddenly disappeared. If not, the value will continually and constantly go up as long as the prices of gold do go up. And I guarantee you, because of how cursed the gold is, and how limited the amount of gold is, and how difficult it is to mine the gold that we currently have in the earth crust, all of that will just means that the value of gold will continually be going up, and that will be a good thing for any currency on the continent anywhere around the world that is backed by gold.
Exactly, and that should be, the economic future of the continent. Back to you, Mr. Engineer. Now, you listen to your co-panelists, and like we mentioned, this institution, the Bank of the Alliance of Sahel States, is expected to fund projects, strategic projects, within the sub-region, especially projects that will go a long way in strengthening the economic autonomy of the region. Now, from your perspective, aside having a currency that's been backed by gold as stipulated by your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD, what other specific advantages, does the Alliance of Sahel States have to offer, which has been some of the lapses or the limitations of these Western financial institutions, on the African continent?
Well, I think in terms of advantages, that's in line with the services that they will have to offer their member countries. I think the first thing will be that I think there will be some sort of stability.
True.
You see, when you have your own bank, development bank, and you are the person financing the bank already in the first place, you will naturally not want to go in for investment in areas that are less productive. And then secondly, we are talking about African countries that are still lagging behind in terms of development. It means that there is naturally going to be what you have just mentioned, strategic investment. In other words, we evaluate projects and we detect particular sectors where we give priority in terms of investment, areas where we know that if we invest here, at least maybe it could create many more jobs for the African continent. It could generate much more income for the African continent and then permit the country to move forward. Secondly, I think the institutions will need to understand that they will need to also offer strategic advice too to member countries. If we are giving you a loan, we maybe need to do some follow-up and advise you on how to go about
using the money.
Exactly. Because these are some of the things we have discovered with the IMF, where they just come in, they say, no, we are going to give this number of billions for payment of teachers, for instance. At the end of the day, the teachers are not still paid. The money is nowhere to be found. IMF doesn't say anything, and they only come back next time again to pump in more money in another sector or in the same sector. They need to advise countries, member states, as to how to go about investing. Secondly, there should be need for sanctioning.
So follow up as well.
Exactly.
For more accountability and transparency.
And with this follow up, there should be room for some sanctions. If you take money that you are investing in a particular sector, and at the end of the day, the investments are not visible, the results are not there, as a consequence of some sort of mismanagement, you should be able to suffer some sanctions too. We should, because with the World Bank and the IMF, I think there has been a great deal of impunity, and I think this impunity is deliberate, because of course the interest is not theirs. The interest in giving the loans is not for Africans, it is theirs. They know the more you embezzle, you always rush back to them. Come talking about rushing back to them, do you know that when we talk about the CFA, for instance, that in France there are 10,000 French citizens who are employed thanks to the 50% reserve that all French colonies using the CFA sent back to France, because we know that all 50% of our reserves are in France.
True.
And that money alone employs 10,000 French citizens, not Africans. Now 50% of your reserves are with them, and when you go back to them, they give you part of your 50% as a loan, and you pay exorbitant rates on that to the French government, not your own government. Whereas I think with this new with this bank coming up, even the issue of interest rates, they know that the objective is to grow themselves.
Sure.
Certainly, even the interest rates will not be that exorbitant. Because, you know, it's like these guys who do what they call in French, les yeux, these money lenders.
Yes.
You have a problem where you need a 100,000 francs, someone gives you 100,000 francs at 30% interest rate. How do you survive with that? Because sometimes when you are going to lend money, it's because you are desperate. And then someone takes advantage of your desperation and then nails you the more, which is interest rate. Whereas if the bank is theirs, they understand that if you are taking money, it's because you want to take yourself out of a certain precarious situation, and so the interest rate certainly will need to drop. This takes us towards sort of flexibility. So this is just to say that in terms of advantages, I want to think that the development bank that the AS is creating, to me, it will really go a long way into resolving some of the lapses that we have had. It will give autonomy to the African countries. And you may even borrow or loan money from the bank, even if, I'm not saying that should be the case, even if you do not respect the debt limits to which you were supposed to pay back, there may be a sense of flexibility where they could evaluate, understand, and give you much more time, but maybe without necessarily play on the interest you are supposed to pay back to them. Secondly, you will realize that they can loan you money and only expect to get back the interest you are supposed to give, but not necessarily giving you money on condition that they will run after your natural resources. Because those are the traps that we have been suffering from the World Bank, some from the IMF. So I think in terms of advantages, we stand to benefit a lot. I say we now, though it is AES, but I say we because if part of Africa is doing well, we are all doing well. You know, someone once said injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. If the worst comes to the worst, maybe some of us will start escaping from Cameroon even to go and settle that way when things begin to move well for them. Or of course, when things start moving well for them, it will encourage other countries, maybe including us. And still in line with that, I want to advise even that other African countries in their respective blocks, if the AU has failed and could not come up with such an initiative, and the AES has started, maybe the other ECOWAS countries should either just align and join or create something. Those of Central Africa should do something. Countries in East Africa should do something. If we eventually group ourselves into just 3, 4, 5 economic groups, you see, it gives more room for an eventual amalgamation for us not to work as an African, as a continent. Exactly. You see, because remember that when David mentioned, I mean the AU or from the Free Trade Continental Zone, where are we with it today? In the days of Gaddafi, they mentioned the issue of the currency already. Where are we with? So these are 3 guys who have come up and they are trying to implement some of those good ideas that had long been spoken of on the continent, but that people lack the courage not only just to implement, but sometimes will not even allow it prosper because they are safeguarding their own interests vis-a-vis the colonial masters that sometimes are responsible for them being in power. So advantages, I think they are plethoric, and we can only pray God that it prospers.
All right, I'll be staying with you, Dr. Mr. NJINE. You mentioned earlier on that it's important for other countries to join the bloc as it's going to, you know, foster growth and development on the African continent. Initially, you stated equally that when a bank is created or an institution is created, whether on the African continent or elsewhere, those that created these institutions, first of all, put their interests first, naturally, before bringing in other external parties. With the creation of this Investment and Development Bank of the Alliance of Sahel States, do you foresee that this bank will be designed first to serve the interests of the African continent, or is going to prioritize, you know, certain regions or economies, like first those? Because let's take a sample like what happened in Niger. Before the military coup, Niger was going through an economic impasse. Yes. But afterwards, as of now, the country is, you know, doing much and much better each day in terms of its economic growth and development. So do you believe that, you know, the bloc, the alliance, will foster, first of all, its own growth before that of the African continent? And what parameters, you know, can be put into place to ensure that every African country that finally integrates the bloc, because we envisage, because this is going to lead, like you mentioned, you said we, and now if we have to have African countries coming into the bloc, what parameters could be put in place to ensure that nobody is left behind? Like there's this sense of unity, you know, that fosters development on the African continent.
To begin with, I don't want to think that the intention here would be to leave anyone behind. On the contrary, parameters will need to be put in place to ensure that those who come in do not come in with this order to destroy the project. True. Because Traore Goita and the general. Yes, these three guys, I want to think they are very smart. I want to think they are very smart, and they know, permit me use the word enemies, they know the enemies they have around them. And we know how desperate France is. And France can eventually look for other strategies to let other people, maybe in quotes, viruses, penetrate them to be able to understand how they intend to operate and then destroy the system from within. And that's why I started by saying, like you were just asking your question, the truth is that the three leaders have proven before getting to this point that their objective is to grow their nations.
Exactly.
When you see the three struggling to form a bloc to stand together, passport, currency, development and investment bank, it is because not only they understand the challenges they are going to face within the ECOWAS zone, but they understand that for them to grow, there is a need for what? Unity. They need to synergize their efforts. I always like to take an example and go back to the European Union. I don't know if our African heads of states ever bother to find out why Europe, as developed as the countries are independently, they keep struggling to come together in what they now call the European Union. With a common currency, their economic policies are the same.
Exactly.
I always say, when you see France come into Cameroon today and they are negotiating a business with Cameroon, the business is for France, but take into considerations the overall benefits of the European Union. But ironically, when they are negotiating with Cameroon, Cameroon goes there as a nation. Her interest is just her interest and does not even affect Nigeria, which is next door neighbor. So I want to think these countries, these three countries, have understood the need for them to work as a bloc, just that we find with the European Union, such that one person's interest automatically becomes the next person's interest. So I rather think that the most important thing here would not be to leave anybody out, but that they should put parameters to ensure that if you decide to join them, you come in and you toe the line. They tell you this is what we have set. You read, if you agree, then you follow. Without which you stay behind because you don't want to align. That's how I think it should be. Because I don't really believe that the three of them will have any interest in wanting to tell a country who is genuinely willing to join them to say, no, we don't want you for now because I really don't think so.
Togo that showed interest.
Good. Now, it doesn't also mean that anybody that comes in showing interest will just be immediately welcome too. They will need to take time to know who is who before they accept everybody onto the platform. It's just like we are talking about presidentials in Cameroon today. People say the Cameroonians should form a coalition. It's true there is a need for a coalition, but you don't just form a coalition with anybody who comes your way saying I need a coalition. In Cameroon, for example, you accept A today, at the verge of election he tells them no, he has withdrawn and he's giving his support to the G20 something, I don't know. So they may need people to join them. They may be hungry to see their African countries and brothers join them all on board, but you need to first of all know who is who before you accept that they come on board, because like I say, France is capable of manipulating countries. I don't want to call countries here particularly. We know some of them. We know of African heads who have outrightly proven that they are working for France and nothing else but France. And if such persons go towards them, believe you me, they can outrightly tell you, wait, let's take our time to discuss amongst ourselves to know if we can integrate you or not. So in terms of advantage, I think that they are plethoric. In terms of who becomes a member, I want to think, I am not part of them, but I want to believe that in their spirit it should be open. You see, though for now they may need to take time to first of all study and know who is who, know the genuineness of each country that may eventually want to become a member of the alliance.
Thank you so much, Mr. NJINE Elvis. Now, we know that this creation of this investment and development bank would not come without geopolitical implications, within the continents of the African or the continents of Africa. But then, Dr. FONGOD, you agree with me that the AES Investment and Development Bank is not a complementary bank or complementary institution for the IMF and World Bank. You made mention of this in your previous response, but then you believe that AES could gradually, with this bank, could become a serious competitor, for these Western financial institutions, or better still, even the African Development Bank.
Absolutely. I think if you think about what is going on currently, for the simple fact that, those three member states basically got yanked out of the Bank of West African State, the Central Bank of West African State, I think that in itself basically pushed them to start innovating. And if you think about what the IMF and all these other banking institutions, the World Bank and everyone in between, and all those other subsidiary funding avenues that have done on the continent of Africa, when they give us these condition-based loans, which means that if they give you a loan, they will tell you precisely what to invest in and where to basically put the money. And I think that in the end, it has not really been of any real value to the African. We need to be able to start, looking at this critically and saying to ourselves, what is it that we need as a people so far as structural development is concerned? What areas of the economy are we trying to invest in, and why are we investing in those areas of the economy? There are certain areas of the economy that if you carry out an investment, it basically have a trickle-down effect. That means secondary industries will emerge, tertiary industries will emerge as a result of the fact that you did investments in certain sectors. If you, for example, if you build up a very robust, energy sector, and the energy sector is doing very well, that means people have constant electricity, then you start leading in a realm where manufacturing is now possible, industrialization is now possible, and you will soon notice that there will be a lot of other people who are basically getting into manufacturing, into basically bringing companies from outside of the countries that want to be able to start producing from within the country, because they are closer to raw materials, as opposed to always shipping raw materials out of the continent to go and manufacture in other parts of the world, which basically takes the local job away and basically renders the economy in those countries where raw materials are being shipped out to just be as poor as they are. If you look at most developed nations and developing and nations that basically have gone away from being in a developing state, you will realize that they are heavy on manufacturing. Look at the country like China, look at the country like India. India is very big so far as it comes to pharmaceutical products, and China basically produces everything in between, and that is as a result of the manufacturing industry basically industrialization basically booming. We need that on the African continent, and I think that the more we begin to now structure the money that we have and then try to push that into those different sectors, it will also now incentivize foreign direct investments into the continent, because just like I said, the market speaks. There are people who will be looking at what is going on and in seeing the development that is taking place, seeing the direction in which these countries are going, and will be like, what, I want to put my money in this particular place because I understand, number one, the security, number two, there is stability so far as the governments are concerned, and that is one of the major crises on the continent of Africa, which is basically stability. Nobody wants to invest their money in the country where they will not, have that confidence that they can be able to pull it out. So once there's stability, so far as the government is concerned, political stability, and then, foreign direct investments will basically come. And secondly, once we realize as Africans, especially those of us in the diaspora, that these countries are doing what they're supposed to do, and the trajectory to which it is that they're moving is in accordance to a Pan-African agenda that seeks to be able to promote, black people on the continent of Africa, then that will really be good. If you look at the global south, countries like Singapore, countries like South Africa, countries like Nigeria, that is doing very well, but then you look in places like the continent of Africa, especially south of the Sahara, you see countries like Niger, before the fall of Bazoum, those were places with serious deficiency in the Human Development Index, but now they are doing tremendously well, and I think that can be the template for every other country in the global south, not just on the continent of Africa. We need to be able to prioritize what we do and where our investments go to. In that way, we understand the terrain and we'll open up, our markets. We will have road infrastructures that will be able to link up markets on the continent of Africa, and in that way, whatever we produce in our individual nations, we should be able to have larger markets to supply and sell what we have, in markets that traditionally it's been difficult for us to reach, just because of the fact that it's not easy to transport what we have with the many untarred roads and totally, unstructured railway systems that we have on the continent of Africa. So I think that is a big push going forward.
A big push that is adding up to the call of a borderless Africa, having a free movement or seamless movement across the African continent. Back to you, Ms. Engineer. How might this emergence or expansion of the Alliance of Sahel States in terms of economics, in terms of, their vision for the shifts, the global financial power dynamics which we're seeing at this point in time?
I think your question is still in line with, maybe, should I put this with, the advantages of their creation?
No problem.
Before now, we have been made to think that without the IMF and the World Bank, we won't go anywhere. And the truth is that before now, like I say, and after now, we've never gone anywhere with them. And there are no prospects that we are going anywhere with them anytime soon. But I think with the AES, it will cause the same IMF and the World Bank, they themselves, to start reviewing their strategy when it comes to Africa. Because the moment they realize that African countries can now create their own investment and development banks, depend on them, and develop their country, they will realize they don't have any space again in Africa.
Exactly.
And by so doing, even without anyone advising them, they will start reconsidering their views as far as Africa is concerned. I think that is even a big push for the AES. It is a big push for Africa, you see. So, talking about the economy, I would tell you that when you look at the AES and what they are doing, it is also going to help other African heads of states and help other Africans to also begin to view life otherwise. You see, when you live in an environment where you have been conditioned to know just one thing and work with just that one thing, you begin to feel like your whole life depends on that one thing. Not until someone, in fact, it's often said that until you compare two things, you never know which one is good. I'm sure that there are countries now that will be waiting, some even praying, that the AES should fail. So that they say, you see, we told you guys that without us, you cannot go anywhere. But by the time they realize, and the Africans themselves begin to notice, that without the European pass, without the IMF, without the World Bank, the AES is making way forward, many leaders will start thinking otherwise. And the one good thing about Africa today is that, despite the fact that our countries are still somehow tied to the loins of the Western countries, at least many more of our leaders are gradually getting a renewal of their mindsets. Many more are gradually beginning to come out from their shelves and trying to challenge some of the things that hither to this moment no one could dare question, you see. So I just want to think that the time for Africa is now. The time for Africa is now, and it is a reason even for more African youth to believe in themselves and believe in. Remember, I saw yesterday I was watching a video, I think from the UN, and they classified African heads of states by virtue of their ages. If I'm not mistaken, I think Traore is the youngest African head of state for now.
Exactly. Yes.
Good. So if you can imagine the youngest African head of state as of now doing such things, you see, then you can imagine what the rest of Africa, of his generation, can be able to do for the African continent with all what African youth today know in terms of technology. So I think even where France particularly is as of now, and then Europe as a whole, I think they are panicking because they understand and they foresee that their time in Africa is up. Let's talk about the other countries where we have the oldest heads of states. We know, like our own case, because when I saw the classification, our own man came last.
So you agree with me that at this point in time, these global powers that initially used to be regarded as economic superpowers in terms of how they lend money to the African continent, and now they perceive the Alliance of Sahel States as some sort of existing financial threat?
Sharon, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Nobody has ever lent money to Africa.
Okay.
No, we should not be fooled. If someone comes here and gives you 100 billion and take your resources worth 200 billion, which is the money he has lent to you? Europe is what it is stands to Africa.
Exactly.
Be it in terms of raw material or human resources.
Exactly.
It stands to Africa. But like my brother Dr. Stanley said, I agree with him that I no longer even blame the Europeans for that. But I blame ourselves, the Africans, because someone scams you the first time, scams you the second time, you actually discover that the man is a scammer, you still give him room to come the third and the fourth time, and you want to think that he's a problem. No, the problem in Africa is us Africans. And that's why I think that, that's why I say I think the time is now for Africans to sit up, understand that we have allowed ourselves to be used and exploited for a very long time, and we need to put an end to it. The only person who can take us out of our precarious situation is us Africans, not the Western world. But we talk about lending money. I will ask you a question. Which projects do we have in this country actually materialize from the loans? If we come back to the case of Cameroon, for instance, we talk about Douala Yaoundé highway. I think this is 15 years today and more. They've not even gone one quarter of the project or one third of the project. But how many thousands of billions have they injected into it? And where does the money come from? From the same institutions we are citing. And they know that the money they gave maybe from the very first loan was capable of financing the project. It never worked. They still give a second, they gave a third, and they are willing to continuously give more. Is that serious? If you are a parent and you tell a child, take this money and buy a loaf of bread or a pair of shoes, and you come back and the money is not there, you may pretend to understand. You say, okay, take again. The child still come back without a pair of shoes, and you choose not to sanction the child. You choose not to question. You choose not to verify what is happening. You continuously give more. The problem is no longer the child. Or except that you, the parent, you have something else you stand to gain by constantly giving money to an irresponsible child who doesn't fulfill the purpose for which the money was given, and you think that you can just continuously give the money. Somebody once asked a question. He said, if like the fight against corruption, bad governance, if you change this bulb because it's blown, you put the second, it doesn't work. You buy the third, it doesn't work. The fourth, it doesn't work, and you keep buying more bulbs, then something's wrong with you. Because you need to stop buying and find out if something is not wrong with the connections or the circuit. But if you keep buying the bulb, is it that you want to put have the money to buy all the bulbs in the market? Or what's the business? So I think the problem to me, sincerely speaking, as Africans, we should even stop blaming the Western powers. They simply understood that we were dumb, and they have been taking advantage of us and doing what they have been doing to their own advantage. Because like we say, it's all about the game of politics, and the game of politics is all about interest. Traore, Ibrahim, Goita, and Tiani have just proven that they know their own political interest, and it is the interest of their people. Their people is their interest first. Their countries is their interest, and they are doing everything to the best of to satisfy their people. So I think what we should be doing is see how we can copy their own example, and that's why I mentioned something here, that even if we cannot all for now join the AES, at least let's take Central Africa. We also step away from the CFA, form our own bloc within Central Africa, maybe come out with our own currency if possible, and then we see how all these countries can use a currency that we have autonomy, that we have a power over, a currency not imposed on us by someone else, an economy where our reserves are not taken from our country and packed or kept in another person's country, that gives employment to his own youth rather than our own citizens. So I think, in a nutshell, that's what I can say.
Thank you immensely. Of course, that is a way, a path forward for Africa. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you know, your co-panelist stated that these plans would not come without, without challenges, would not come without pitfalls. But then, from your perspective, what can these blocs ensure or do to ensure that there is some sort of sustainability, that these projects, it stays over time and, of course, serves the interests of the people for which the bank was initially created?
The reality is that there is no way in which we can be talking about the lack of difficulties, and the reason for that is because we do not even know what kind of difficulties we will be facing, except from some things that will pull out of an academic, book or dissertation to be able to talk about, what the issues might be, especially when you're trying to create a currency in a hostile environment like the one we have. The reality is that we expect that there will be pushbacks from every single circle, and every block there will be pushback for sure. There'll be pushback from the West, there'll be pushback from countries like France, the United States, and everyone in between. But the reality is this: you have to come to ask yourself questions like, at what point am I willing to bend, and for how long? At what point will I be willing to allow this level of oppression, manipulation continue? And for how long will I decide that I will allow this to happen to me, on a very consistent basis when I know precisely what is going on? What will you do about it? The question here for me is not about the difficulties and how to manage the difficulties. That is not the issue. The difficulties will come. The question is, are we willing to be able to stand up irrespective of whatever garbage is thrown at us, especially when it comes to deciding that we need a currency, we need to be able to create our own future and craft and hunt, exactly all things that pertains to the desires we have, the ambitions we have to build the Africa that we want. That is the question. The question is all about zeal, it's all about determination, it's all about the will to fight. And if, frankly speaking, we are willing to fight, I don't think that there's anything that is as difficult, for us on the continent of Africa as to be able to emancipate our minds and stand and fight. One of the disappointing thing I have with Africans is that for some strange reason, we seems to be the dumbest people on planet Earth. We behave like Pentecostals who is in love with the false prophet. Those are some of the most difficult people to advise in this life. And the reason is because they are so delusional that they have no idea they are sitting underneath a con man. That is the problem with Africans. Black people, for some strange reason, we get emotional when we need to be intelligent. We decide to be able to flaunt God knows what at the, on people's faces, call it progress. Meanwhile, it's nothing else but just a total sham. We are so gifted in celebrating everything that is outside of the continent of Africa, and we will not celebrate who we are as a people. You wear a Louis Vuitton, you wear, a Nudro Brackler, you wear God knows what kind of a designer cloth, and, and you will not be able to wear something that is African, because for some strange reason you have been told that what is Western is good and what is African is basically quite poor, and what is African is not as developed, and so you don't want to associate with the continent. That is the demented mindset that we have as Africans. I think that there needs to be a revolution in the conscience of the African. There need to be some kind of a revolution where we begin to change the way we allow our people to think, that we need to let the African appreciate their Africanness. All right, appreciate the beauty of who they are as a people, and obviously our leaders are a prime example of this level of buffoonery. Where did they take their vacations? Europe. Where did they go for their medical treatment? Europe. Where did they go for send their kids to go and study? Europe. All right, they fly to Americas. They are everywhere else. You don't hear anyone. When was the last time you heard an African president saying, you know what, I'm just trying to go to Cairo, I'm trying to go to Timbuktu, I'm trying to be, in Dar es Salaam. You don't see any of that stuff. We go to Europe, we fly to Saudi Arabia, we go all over the world. All right, we're in Washington, D.C., and the only place we visit is home. And the reason for that is because we have not developed home to that level. All right, and so you have all of our own people who basically have no interest in helping or building anything, use the money they're supposed to use in building the continent, in building our individual nations, and they invest all of that money outside of the continent of Africa. They have some of the best hospitals outside of the continent of Africa. They have some of the best schools outside of the continent of Africa, and right in the continent of Africa, we basically have nothing to show for it. That's the reality of the African. So in partnership, borrowing from my brother, Mr. NJINE, I think that the reality is this, that we need now to have a mirror. I think that the African needs to be able to have something to look at. And the only thing that the African should look at is a mirror, because the greatest enemy the African has had for the last 60 years is the person the African sees in the mirror. And believe me, the mirror is not a television screen, it's a regular mirror. It's a reflection of another African who has been the greatest pain for the continent of Africa. So we need to be able to fight that.
Indeed, it's time for Africa. Like Ms. NJINE said, the time is now for Africans to take up action. Ms. NJINE, you mentioned earlier on that there is this wave that is blowing, a wind that's blowing across Africa, you know, with the AES trying to come up with new initiatives to foster development within the region. From your perspective, what is truly needed to take Africa out of, you know, financial bondage?
Well, if we have to step ourselves out of financial bondage, I think first thing is investment. And when I talk about investment, strategic investment, we do not invest and invest haphazardly. You know, by the way, I will tell you, when we talk about financial bondage, we have never been poor. I still say this.
Exactly.
We have never been poor. We have all the material. You see, and for us to grow out of the financial bondage, because what we have may not be the liquid cash.
Exactly.
But we have what can give us the liquid cash. We have the raw material. And we cannot take our raw material and we export it the way it is in its primary states and expect to grow rich. Now that we have people who are thinking that we need a development bank, an investment bank, I think that we have just mentioned before in this same program, there should be strategic investment where we know the sectors where to invest. We should learn to understand there is a need for us to transform our raw material into finished products and then we consume and then sell part of the country. It is only in that way that we are going to raise the necessary cash that we need to invest in other areas. Because for as long as we keep living in that mindset where we think that when we get the raw material, we send out of the country and we get cash, no, we are not going anywhere with that. And like I keep saying, those are some of the areas where we have been tied down for many years, though out of our own stupidity. If you come to a country like Cameroon, for instance, they tell you have Sonara, you see, but that Sonara, the equipment, the installations there are so are not up to standard to refine your own petrol. So what happens? You take the raw material, you send out, and then you buy back again from another country. When you have a whole company that was supposed to be refining, there is a problem with that. So when you talk about how do we get finances for ourselves in Africa, first thing, we have the raw material. We stake the raw material against the finances by doing what? By transforming the raw material and then exporting the finished goods. Let I think we have Ivory Coast, we have Ghana. Let them be able to cultivate their cocoa alongside Cameroon, for instance. We transform it to chocolate and then we sell the chocolate to the Western world. They enjoy eating chocolate. If you take France, they are one of the best in production. You have Swiss, you have France. But these are countries that do not produce cocoa. You see, but they are the #1 producer of chocolate. Where do they get the cocoa beans? From Africa. Why can't we also produce and we sell the finished products to them? When you look at the kilogram or the grams of chocolate they sell to you back in Cameroon for 1,000 francs, 2,000 francs, it's appalling. You see, so we give them raw material practically for free, and then we buy the finished product exorbitantly. And I want to think that if we reverse the process, that we process it here and then we sell the finished products, already automatically we are sure. Secondly, doctor mentioned that already in passing, that if we can also invest in certain sectors, we have infrastructure, we have roads, and then we industrialize energy, for instance, automatically it gives room for secondary investments, because there are some areas where the moment you inject money, you automatically give room for other people to create other companies surrounding what you have already instated. So I want to think that generating more income for us in Africa is not the problem. What is the problem? The real problem is knowing exactly where to invest and to ensure that there is some sort of follow-up such that by the time you invest, you actually attain the goals that you had in mind. By so doing, automatically you find the income coming, and it gives room for many more companies to open up. Secondly, talking about investing, I think the question now is almost global now. It's no longer just about AES. You realize that another way to generate income is for governments to understand the need for what we call broad-based taxing system. In other words, instead of increasing taxes on companies, which end up discouraging many companies and some even shutting down, you could rather reduce these taxes. It will permit even people to create more companies. The more the companies with lower taxes they pay, the more the income for the state. Because if you have 10,000 companies in the country, I just want to give a practical example, and they are paying 1,000 francs each, you make more money than having just 10 of those companies paying 100,000 francs each. That is one other thing we have, because in a country like ours here, you realize that at the end of the day, is the leaders we have believe that they can only make more money by constantly skyrocketing the tax system, which is not the best. On the contrary, you drop the tax on the people, and you give them room to create more companies, and now the more the companies, you generate more income from them. So there are a variety of ways we can grow out of our financial hardship in this country, in Africa as a whole, and then Cameroon in particular. You know, I always tell you, Sharon, each time I'm on your platform, that there are some examples, since we always discuss Pan-African issues here, but there are examples I would never want to go into them far away, because Cameroon is an incarnate of all the wrongs that we find on the African continent when it comes to management and other things. So we need finances, yes, but we have what it takes in terms of human resources, in terms of natural resources. It all depends now on the policies we put in place. It all depends on the vision that the leaders have. But unfortunately, most of our leaders are people without a vision for their people. They are people who, some of them who came to power and who were surprised by power, and so at the end of the day have never had a clear social project for their nations, like the case of Cameroon, for instance, where we are. I always want to insist and tell Cameroonians that in 2025 we are in a year where we must fight to also become to start doing what the AS is doing. We must fight to have a leader at the helm of the country who has a vision for this country, who has a dream for young Cameroonians to grow. We should fight to have someone who can give instructions and be able to follow up to ensure that what he has instructed to be done is quite done, and that it's done the right way, so that we see the fruits of it and every other person benefits from that.
So everything boils down to political will. And thank you so much, Mr. NJINE. Meanwhile, to get to you, Dr. FONGOD, before we come back and close up today's edition of the conversation, having listened to your co-panelists, from your own perspective, just adding up to what Mr. NJINE said, what is the way out of the financial impasse on the African continent, and charting the way forward? Do you see the AES, reshaping global finance?
Absolutely. I think that I was laughing the whole time Mr. NJINE was talking, and the reason is because, I was reminded of the famed Cameroonian artist who passed a couple of years ago. That would be Lapiro Dimbaga. In my so-called not polished pidgin and not polished ways in which I could understand exactly what Lapiro was singing about, but I remember perfectly well talking about the issue of the national debt. Lapiro said something like this. He said that when it comes to the issues of I'm just paraphrasing, when it comes to the issues of the national debt, is that the problem is they have taxed everybody, they're taxing everybody, to pay the Bayam Salams, the Bensikiner, the everybody else, the guys, Dickinson and God knows what. He says, but the problem is that he asked a couple of questions to ask. He said the first question is, how much of this whole entire stuff is the national debt? We don't know. The second thing is, of this national debt, how much of that has been paid? We don't know. What is the interest rate on this national debt? We don't know. And then in a typical Lapiro fashion, he concludes by saying, in pidgin, he says, this one, na grand frère forfait. Anyone can translate. This is the highest level of corruption, right? Like 419 was coming. And I think that is basically what we suffer so far as the continent is concerned. First of all, when you increase taxes on businesses, what you do eventually is that you're not taxing those businesses, you're actually taxing the people in the country. The fallacy or the stupidity that people think is that when you increase taxations on small to medium-sized enterprises, for some strange reason, small to medium-sized enterprises will just sit on the sideline. No, they consider that to be cost of production. So when cost of production goes up, the prices of the goods, that they're producing basically goes up also. That means who pays more? The consumer. And who are the consumers? The local populace, the people in the population who are using those goods and services. That is the problem. But when you reduce, taxes on businesses, you incentivize those businesses to basically expand, and then you also have more people coming into the sector. And if more people come into that particular market producing similar goods and services, two things will happen. Prices will drop and quality will rise. And so you have improved improve in quality, and then you have reduction in prices because now there's competition in the marketplace. That is basic economics 101. And unfortunately, I don't think we know that, in these, places where we basically just want to tax everybody into the high heavens because we are trying to run, this government. The second thing is this: no accountability. We don't know exactly how much money, we generate per year. Those information is not public record. We don't know precisely where this money is going. That information is not public record. There is zero accountability on anything. And partly speaking, this is not just an African thing. Recently in the United States, we just basically, got wings of as to how this country has been spending money, and everybody is going crazy about it. But there has to be some real version of accountability. And I think that so far, those boys in the Sahel has given us a template on the continent of Africa as to how good things can be. And if that was going to be the case, I am quite hopeful. I'm very, very hopeful, extremely hopeful that if I look at the continent of Africa, it looks bleak. The future looks dark. But when I look at the continent of Africa from the lens of what is happening in the Sahel, I see a future that is truly remarkable. A future laced with prosperity, where young people have the capacity to espouse all their given abilities and talents, and has the desire and has this unique ability to be able to foster a future that will rival anything else that we see outside of the continent of Africa. The sons of the soil, the sons of Africans are building robust industries all around the world. It's been well documented in all spaces. And the reality is this, that what they're doing overseas, they can do it if the environments were right on the continent of Africa. I am hopeful that somehow change will come. I am dreaming that somehow, the brightness that this continent has will basically begins to shine, that there will be no obstacle, no oppression. The sounds of AK-47s will not be able to drown the Africans' desire for freedom. I am hopeful. And on that, I also still believe that Africa's future looks really bright.
Indeed, the continent's future looks bright. That was Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who joining us in his capacity as a political analyst, Pan-Africanist, economist, and as well the CEO of Creston FINTECH. Now, to culminate today's edition with you, Mr. NJINE ELVIS, giving you in the studio with us. Just to wrap up this whole conversation, what's your way forward for the African continent? Well,
I would simply say the way forward to me would just be a change of the mindset. Africans should try to review their mindsets, and perhaps this will have to do with also the education that we give the youth on our continent. And if I may address the youth particularly, I would say if in certain countries in Africa, the leaders do not still accept to change the educational system to suit the African context, at least we can, through different social media outlets, through the internet, also do our own personal research, learn from other countries, learn from what is happening in AES, and then at least what is happening in other African countries around too, and see what we can be able to do. Let every individual at his or her own level try to do something positive that can impact the life of his country in whatever way, or at least begin with your own little community where you find yourself, because like we say, we must believe in ourselves as Africans and understand and integrate that in us, that the Western world has never helped us in any way, and that they will never help us in any way, and that we are like, permit me use the word orphans. We are not, but we are like orphans that are abandoned to themselves, and we have just ourselves to depend on to be able to make way forward. So I think the future is bright, depending on how we view it, depending from what prism we see it. And then of course, since I'm rounding off, I may have another chance to talk. I would just want to encourage Cameroonians to understand that there is a need truly for us to advance like we see other countries in Africa doing, and that for us to advance in this country, there is a need for us to begin by reviewing who leads this country come October 2025.
Indeed, and on that note, I'll say thank you so much, Mr. NJINE ELVIS. You joined us as a member of the UFR,
the Union for Reconstruction, that has Barrister CAMEROON as its candidate.
You're equally the Secretary General of the Popular Actions Party and a political analyst. Ladies and gentlemen, like you heard it right, the time for Africa to change is now. Time for action is now. It's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And we'll have a great day in company of our numerous programs.